Okay, again, good morning, everybody. And right now, if you could chat in and tell me that you are seeing my screen. I just took the pre-test down, and I'd like to know if you can see the screen, because if you can, then we're ready to go. Okay, thank you. Great. Welcome. My name is Wendy Hilsenrod. I'm a training specialist at TAASA. I have been in this role or worked for TAASA for 13 years or so. And I came to TAASA through various routes, but one of the first things that I noticed before I came to TAASA and was doing direct services, I was working both at a rehab clinic and at a sexual assault shelter or dual shelter, and my role was sexual assault. And one of the things that I immediately saw a gap in service in was that there were a bunch of addicted survivors of sexual assault, either in shelter or in the rehab, both males and females, but we weren't seeing females in shelter at that point in time. So this training is based upon most of those observations and anecdotal stuff that I have found, and in the intervening 20 odd years, some of the research to support it. So part one is basically about the dynamics of what we're seeing in sexual assault and survivors and how they got to where they were. And part two, which is next week, at the end of next week, is about some of the tools and group therapy work that I did with at the rehab. Okay, so moving on, that's about me. Moving on, want to say that TAASA is a statewide advocacy organization that works to address and eliminate sexual violence through public policy, training, prevention work, and to support programs that serve survivors of sexual assault. TAASA is also, we like to think of ourselves as a unifying voice to eliminate sexual violence in Texas. As a statewide coalition of rape crisis centers, advocates, and survivors, we are committed to fostering a culture that respects the fundamental rights and dignity of all people. All right. Survivors are always introduced to a sexual assault advocate due to one particular event. That event may not define who, well, I'll rephrase that. That one event may define who the survivor is in the moment. It does not holistically define who the survivor is. People are complex, nuanced, and very, very skilled at surviving in their world. Okay, I want to invite you to take a moment and think about a time when you had to make an immediate decision under desperation and or duress, whatever that may be. You don't have to share that, but think about a time where you had to make that decision immediately. It was a matter of life and death, maybe for you, your child, your sister, your parent, whatever it was. Now, think about how that would feel if every decision you make all day, every day, involves decisions of crisis proportions. Did you have a gut reaction? Did you get an overwhelming feeling of exhaustion? Maybe a feeling of why even bother? Withdraw? You know, this is what addicted survivors feel almost every day, that everything is going to be extremely overwhelming for them. Every decision that they make is huge and it is exhausting. In 2013, Jake LaPierre said, sexual abuse is a gateway experience that often leads to drug addictions. Anybody ever hear of that or think about drug addiction in that way or sexual abuse in that way, I thought that that was phenomenal. And I did a little more research on that. And what I came up with was that we have a language for gateway drug usage. And we fail to have a language or to identify other gateway experiences that lead to drug use. What do you think those gateway experiences for sexual assault survivors who are addicted are? And you can check that in. I'd love to hear what your views are because mine can be very, very different. They usually are. Any ideas on what some gateway experiences can hear? Desiree, if you can't hear, please call in. The number is at the top of the chat box. And good, I'm glad you can hear. Okay, so what would you think those experiences could be? How about childhood abuse? How about grooming? How about, I don't know, molestation? Great. How about ADD or ADHD or child, because of all the underlying stuff, neglect, isolation, gets labeled in school as learning disabled or ADD or ADHD. And that's not what it is, but then they're labeled as a delinquent. All these things are gateway experiences for sexual abuse, all right? We also have a language for disgrace. I just said that. Delinquent, molested, battered. We have that language for disgrace. Failure to thrive, not advancing in school. Can we create a language for the hope and the strength and the courage that it takes to transform? Do we have such a language? Does it roll off of our tongues each and every time we're talking with our survivors? In this day and age, there seems to be little shame now to admit in using or maybe abusing alcohol or marijuana. But there's a whole bunch of shame and secrecy and denial to admitting to being a victim of sexual assault as well as a victim of substance abuse, and even worse, substance abuse and sexual assault. Okay. Chandra, all I can say is that if you cannot see, I cannot help you with that right now, but the PowerPoint will come, so please just listen, okay? All right, so moving on. There are a bunch of obstacles to discussing a history of sexual assault. Basically, until we as professionals are willing to have uncomfortable discussions with the survivor about the abuses, all of the abuses they have survived, and we're not going to have significant gains with social problems. But more important, where do we as advocates start the conversation with the survivor? And if we are going to start a conversation with the survivor, where does our grant tell us that we can or cannot go, and what's going on with that? So how do we even broach that? Because children who have survived abuse and neglect from the time that they are very, very young have learned shame from their earliest days. And that shame can place them at a greater risk of substance abuse later on in life. For people who have survived traumatic losses and are taking something to help with that pain, someone who lost a child or a spouse or was in a car wreck and witnessed something awful, that can lead. There are different dynamics coming into abuse. I want us all to be perfectly aware of that, because when we start the conversation, what we don't want to do is to trauma bomb the survivor with a bunch of questions. We want a conversation to happen naturally and organically about, and trauma informed as best we can, about starting at the edges of their experiences and moving in, and also emphasizing the physical violence that the perpetrator chose to do to them, not what they did in the moment. Okay, we need to reconceptualize dual diagnosis treatment. It used to be called comorbidity, and I am so glad that we're not calling it anymore, because that's a horrible label to pop on someone. And it just, in my opinion, adds more shame and hopelessness to the survivor. But oftentimes when we have an addicted survivor, we ask, demand, or force the survivor into recovery, into rehabilitation programs, and then release the survivor from these programs, and then they're forced to enter other programs designed to, quote, air quotes here, help them. And the survivor fails to comply, and we don't take we just don't realize that what we're doing is meet the old boss, same as the new boss, the power and control that we have over them, and we list all the things that we have done for the survivor or ask them to do, and how they failed. They didn't fail. The system that we work in, the whole system that we work in, has failed in. We need to understand that making change is really, really hard work, and that we're asking the survivor each and every day to claim personal power over each abuse that they have experienced. And this is monumental, and it's overwhelming, and it can be debilitating, as well as liberating and triggering. Being scared is one thing, being triggered is another. And we're going to talk about all of these dynamics as we go on today. But what I really want to say is, what stops us from understanding that all the abuses, all of them, the dynamics of them, the power and control issues, the manipulation of perpetrators, and sometimes even systems, are the same? And when they collide together, why do we have to silo them into one experience or the other? This is where my mind gets a little blown, because I'm going to tell you, if we silo experiences, we're not helping anyone integrate their experiences to have their aha moments, if that's what they choose to do, and to move on. Because I am convinced, in all the years and in all my experience that I have in the field, that survivors do not have just one story to tell. They have many, many stories. You know, and what is our job as advocates? It is basically to listen and to believe everything that the survivors tell us. That is really, really important. So survivors make assumptions about users. I mean, society makes assumptions about users. Can you tell me what assumptions you have about users? When you think of an addict, what comes to your mind? What do you think? What's the vision that flashes in your head? It could be poverty. It could be a number of things. And see, when we start talking Low SES, socioeconomic status, struggle, that's one thing. How about white collar workers? Multiple stresses, struggle, anything that puts somebody at risk to compound. But when we deny the faults and weaknesses, it makes us artificial. But worse, I think what we have in our head is, at least I know that the agencies that I used to work for, is that you're wasting your resources on someone who is using. And I'm not necessarily sure if that's true or not. But, you know, what would be more socially acceptable? What do we do when somebody shows up at our door and we tell them that we cannot serve them because they're actively using and we turn them away? What stage does that set for the survivor? What immediately are we telling them and setting them up for? Okay, so what came first, the addiction or the sexual trauma? What do y'all think? Trauma. Okay. We're having a trauma, and sexual trauma seems to be, and it depends. I'm going to tell you what, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it matters. What I think matters is the kind of care, attention, information, and education an addicted survivor gets, which we are more than capable of providing. Either way, it's very, very important. It may be important for their recovery when you know how they came in, because it's very important. However, it doesn't matter initially, just to know that they need our services, and that is something that we need to do. So knowing the pathway into addiction that the survivor took into addiction is going to be a key to their recovery, but it's not often clear how they got there. So if you ask them, how did it begin? But when did you become addicted? And in particular, when did you notice that you were addicted? If that's a tick on an intake, they're just going to make up something because they really don't know. They are coming to you for help. They want something. So that can add another layer of shame. It can add another of meet the old boss, new boss, and it adds to, I mean, I worked in an addiction center that what they used to say is, oh, that's what they told you? If their lips were moving, they were lying. And I just find that horrifying, you know? So asking them about how they got in is a different story than when they noticed that they were addicted, all right? But it's going to be key to understand how they got into their recovery. How many people joined this webinar because they're now noticing the opioid addiction in their community? Okay, I'm going to tell you that that's one pathway in, and it's a very different dynamic when your doctor is your first dealer. All right, but there's way beyond that to go on. So we're going to look at all of them, okay? Because there are multiple pathways into addictions, but they're all based on one basic behavior, the misuse and or abuse of substances. And this can manifest in a variety of ways, like using prescription drugs more often and at higher doses than prescribed, which means they're going to the addict is going to start shopping around for different doctors to prescribe without telling them they're already seeing another doctor and using different pharmacies. This indicates they're very smart, but also they're creative in their ways of sustaining their addictions. They also have maybe some insurance to cover this. You know, there's experimenting with highly addicted substances for the purposes of pleasure seeking or recreational purposes because their peers are doing so and it wasn't intended, but guess what happened? Using substances to self-medicate because they're in an abusive relationship where they can't go to the doctor. It's not allowed, or they're in poverty, or they can't get to the clinic because they don't have money, or they have mental health issues and or physical disorders that are causing them pain. There's also involvement with social groups that accept or participate in drug abuse as a way of socializing. Think about, I'm thinking right now with the program Cheers, where that whole social group was about drinking in a bar, and some people got addicted and some people weren't. Some people were always there. Some people were high end, as they call them, white collars. They had a big tolerance for the addiction. So we need to find that out as well. Okay. What's also key to recovery is the relationship that is being co-created between the addicted survivor and the advocate. Think about that for a moment. What is the first thing that an advocate generally says to a rape survivor? Generally. We generally say, you did everything right. You survived. You got here. It's not your fault. These are the things that we generally say to rape survivors. What do we say to people who were raped due to substances and they themselves took their substances? I would still hope that it's not your fault. The behavior is with the person who used that against you. It's still not your fault. Okay, so it's very important that that is one of the first messages that they hear. Very, very important. Okay, all right. So our clients, and I just want to stop here and say that I'm the only one here today monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, please chat them in. And if I see them flash in front of the screen, I will stop and do it. If not, I'll take a break here and there, and I will try to go back and review them. Okay. Okay. Because our clients have lived through, they really lived through some traumatic events. They've developed survival skills, and these survival skills are now causing them unwanted consequences. And yet they're still using these outdated skills, like beating their head against the wall, expecting a different result other than pain, and that's really not going to happen. So I'm going to ask you to kind of look at these survival skills and flip it around, because I want us to capitalize on the survival skills that they created, because learning something new is hard work. They have the willingness, they have the intelligence, they thought out something that has allowed them to live so far. So this is going to be hard work. No one likes hard work. And we need to acknowledge that this is hard work for ourselves to understand as advocates what they're going to, and the survivors to understand that this is hard work as well. And because of the heroism it takes to maintain survival skills, learning new ones, learning sobriety, learning to overcome feelings of never going to be able to live a clean and sober and happy and joyous and free life, or the internal strength it takes to break free from unhealthy loyalties to both the perpetrators and the drug, has to be acknowledged and honored by both the survivor and the advocate. And it's going to be the advocate who is going to do that acknowledgement and honoring at the initial stages, because I'm willing to bet that our survivors cannot do that for themselves in this time, initially in this time and space. Okay. So 5, because addiction is a complex illness, and it's characterized by compulsive drug cravings, seeking, and using and use that persist even in the face of negative consequences. And that's where all the denial comes in. And I, never being an addict myself, with the addicts that I have talked to, cravings are very, very, very bad place to be in. It feels terrible. It feels so terrible that it triggers, even when you're trying to be clean and sober, it triggers. I know how your body memory is. Oh, I remember how to take care of this. I need to get drugs. And that's when the drug seeking behavior starts to come in, even though they know that they're negative consequences. You just want to feel better in the moment. Okay, so 5 factors that contribute to addiction, and this comes from the American Psychological Association. Okay, genetics. There is a predisposition or personality, personal addiction to drugs, to addictions, but that's just about half of a person's tendency to become addicted. Genes have been linked to a quicker reaction to drugs, a decreased ability to feel negative consequences, or an increased sense of euphoria, a quick involvement with repetitive behaviors, which lead to an addictive personality. And these genetic factors can cause experimental drug use to quickly spin out of control and make it difficult to stop. Environmental factors that contribute can be, as some of you already listed, poverty, divorce, a frequency of arguments in the home, mental illness, the physical home where somebody grew up in, whether there was addiction in it or abuse, or just think of all abuses. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual abuse in the home. The community location, work conditions, high stress levels, all these things, by, what does somebody use to de-stress? Some children grow up in homes and learn to mimic the behaviors that are there. Some don't. Trauma is the big one. Often trauma are the deep, unseen scars that can cause someone to use to dull their pain. We've got the ACEs studies that have come back and are looking, the links between childhood trauma and adult substance abuse is very much there. There's a big correlation. And again, I want to say correlation does not always denote cause. There's mental illness. More than half the substance abusers found in the study done by the APA indicate that half of the substance abusers are also dealing with some form of mental illness. And it's a matter of them trying to relieve the stress and the pain associated with their mental illness. For others, the drug abuse sets off a series of events that causes a mental illness diagnosis. So what came first, doesn't matter, it's there. And peer pressure. If you're married or going out with someone or want to be part of a peer group that uses, it doesn't matter what age you are, you're being influenced a lot by who the people are who surround you. If you work in an office that's extremely high stress and everybody goes out after work to get a drink to de-stress, you know what? You may or may not go with them. You may or may not adopt their behaviors, because what you want is, quote, if you're in a relationship with someone, and interpersonal relationship, you want peace in that relationship, or you want to fit in, it's not that. Someone who's impulsive by nature, and make snap decisions without thinking about consequences or long-term effects can be linked to that poor self-control, can be linked to having a difficulty interacting with others, and drug abuse can help numb that or help them relax more to fit in. But what I want to say is all of these 5 factors by themselves do not indicate addiction. They may be red flags, but there are people who have all of these 5 factors and do not use or become addicts or stop after their first negative experience. So we need to be careful. We need to understand, but we also need to understand that we need to dig a little bit deeper. Okay. Some of the risk factors that are involved with that, you can see they're external and internal factors, and people struggling with these factors tend to be more likely, that's the key word here, more likely to initiate drug abuse. They may also be more likely to develop addictions, but that's not always the case. Okay. All right, so factors that we don't often consider: medical, which is these pathways in, curiosity, media, and jobs. These are part of the multiple pathways in that we often don't think about to include in an intake, and I've touched on these, but how does the media encourage someone to use or make it like, I wonder what that's about? Think about the words that the media uses to describe especially Hollywood type lifestyles of, people going out and partying and the romance that goes along with it, all that stuff. We don't think of white. I worked with a client whose mother was absolutely shocked that her daughter's husband was an addict because he was an electrical engineer, and that didn't happen there. So if you're, like you said, Yvonne, if you're glorifying the high, why not? And that's where your focus is. That's what you want in your life. Why would you not do that? Why would you not begin to try? So we need to think about where this comes from. All right, at this point, I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to ask you all if there's any questions or comments that you want to make right now before we move on to the next portion. Okay. All right. Thanks, Juan. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk now about the dynamics of substance abuse. Here they are. You're going to have adverse consequences. You're going to have compulsion, cravings. I'm going to go into them for a little, right now, just touch on them. Adverse consequences means that using assumes priority over all other needs, including personal, financial security, comfort, relationship help, employment, even though the survivor knows it's causing problems in all areas of their life, and their capacity to manage their life on all levels is going out the window. Compulsion is the ritual, the OCD-ness, if you will, of feeling compelled to use, the loss of control for and over your user's choice. Sometimes the user unsuccessfully attempts to control or regulate their substance abuse. I have an addiction to caffeine. I will be the first one to tell you that. And in the morning, my ritual, my compulsion for my caffeine is to get up, to grind my beans, to put the kettle on the stove, to listen to it whistle, to smell the coffee. Those are things that start my day. And I've heard other people who have been addicted to cigarettes talk about how buying a new pack and pounding it down and opening it up and taking that first drag, that's a ritual. That's a compulsion. That's the OCD-ness of having something that gives you whatever it is. For me, I know that starting my morning in this fashion, if someone is kind enough to make me coffee in the morning, I feel cheated, even though I appreciate the effort, because I did not get to do my compulsion, my ritual. And this compulsion can go straight to triggers, seeing someone who is high in someone else, or someone who is using, or watching someone on TV who's about to shoot up or taking their rigs out. They rarely show you someone shooting up on TV. Okay, cravings, intense psychological preoccupation with getting or using or feeling intense internal discomfort and anxiety and agitation, with the exception of recalling the euphoria of using the substance. Cravings feel really, really bad. And Dina, thank you for that, because social media gives you the fun recipes for alcohol, or it looks like people are having fun while using, and they shoot all these pictures and they're holding beer bottles or margarita glasses or whatever. Thank you for that. Okay, denial. The user, under intense pressure of acute craving, is going to temporarily blind them to the risks and consequences of using. They're going to deny it because their distortion or perception caused by the craving is just distorted. Their craving causes distortions, but just this once it won't hurt. That's denial. Okay, psychological. As dependence upon the drug decreases, the addict becomes less adept at coping. Your confidence and self-esteem are usually lost, and the addict often uses to enhance the perceived rewards of other experiences. Like it's more fun to use while having sex in social situations. And this boosts the user's sense of self-worth and alleviates their stress and tension in other areas where they are spinning out of control. Okay. All right. Biological. Substance abuse fundamentally alters the pathways in the brain to the brain's pleasure centers, and it robs the brain's normal ability to experience pleasure. I'm going to say that again because this is critical. Drugs, whatever drugs that you are taking, steal the brain's normal ability to experience pleasure. There is called the cocaine rebound effect. Please look that up. I don't have time on this webinar to go into it, but it decreases, the brain loses its normal capacity to create reward and pleasure, which causes the user to feel depressed, anxious, frustrated, and ultimately craving their drug of choice, because their drug of choice makes them feel rewarded and creates pleasure and keeps them out of that depressed, anxious, and frustrated cycle. I'm talking about the drug now being the perpetrator, having power and control over the addict. Everybody get where I'm going with this? Because this is going to be crucial. All right. The injury caused by the drug in the brain's reward center needs time to heal after, while the person is in sobriety. At the same time, the brain is screaming. As the brain's getting back to normal, the brain is also screaming to the addict that it needs the drug in order to not feel these feelings, that happily, joyous, free, you're going to have a good life that everybody talks about when you give up your addiction. Initial recovery sucks. I can't say that. I can't stress that enough. I'm going to talk about it later on. Okay. Tolerance of a substance is a strong indication of addiction. And social networks woven between users codifies for them bonding or ritualized bonding and belonging. So substance abuse often becomes a crucial part of a group's integrity. Drugs can serve as a social disinhibitor, taking away inhibition, social discomfort, and tension. Is there any questions about this? Because these dynamics, especially the cravings, the compulsion, the denial, the psychological, the biological, the social, are so important for the addict. Okay. Because what is said in addiction counseling is that when addiction happens, life stops and survival begins. It also means that when life stops, wherever you are emotionally, your emotional maturity has stopped there and you are focused solely on survival. Okay, the dynamics of sexual assault. I'm going to go through these because this is basically what we are all trained to do here. I'm talking about the dynamics in a really different way. I'm not going to go over the visual, the verbal, emotional, 1 through 6. I'm not going to go over. I'm going to talk a little bit about spiritual abuse, which we don't really talk about, and we need to understand that when someone is going over spiritual abuse, they're getting spiritually abused. Someone is using power and control of religion over we can't talk to this person or their position in the church as abuse over. That's adult. For children, it's very different. For me, spiritual abuse for children simply means that someone has told them that they are stupid for believing in fairy tales and Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and taking that sense of awe and wonder out of the world for them. And that is, for me, really critical. Or the child's also been told, quote unquote, God don't like ugly, God's going to get you for that, God's always watching you, you better behave. Those are things that we see a lot in spiritual abuse. And if you don't have that sense of awe in your life, that sense of wonder, where's your hope for the future? That's just very quickly. I'm also going to go over briefly teasing, sarcasm, bullying as a subset of verbal abuse, but what is true about all of the teasing and sarcasm is they're generally done in front of a group of people. They can be hurtful, unwelcoming, they border on harassment, and when someone says, ouch, that hurts, however they do it in verbal form, the comeback is generally, what the hell is wrong with you? I was just playing with you. I was just teasing you. You have no sense of humor. And the person begins to think, did I misinterpret that? What the hell is going on here? And if you're addicted, if you're addicted and you are not, and you've been abused by this person, who are you giving your power to? Who has the power and control over you? Sarcasm, there's a very big difference in telling someone with all the love in your voice, your body, in your eyes, and your smile, I love you, than putting your hands on the hip, making your eyes go stone cold sober, no expression or coldness in your eyes, no expression on your face, you know, hostility in your body language and saying, I love you. They are the same words, but that is not the same intended effect. So when someone says, how did they told me they love me, how did they say that? What do they do? We need to explore that a little bit more. Bullying is the behavior. It's the aggressive behavior that models real or perceived power imbalance. And it's usually done at least once before, like all kind of abuse, so that it's not an empty threat. We believe that it's going to happen because as a survivor, we have witnessed it before, all right? Isolation can be demanded, but it is totally separating and dividing, which is what perpetrators do, the survivor from anybody who could help them. And it has two purposes, again, to keep keep the survivor away from anyone that might, quote, steal them from the perpetrator, and to keep the survivor away from anyone that may influence them to make a different choice. All right? All right. We talk about exploitation or abandonment. Abandonment is to totally neglect, totally, you know, not even care about someone. To me, the opposite of love is hate. And hate still means you have feelings towards, but abandonment means you could care less about the person. Exploiting someone is the perpetrator is using them for their own personal gain. And I want to make a side note here. If we want to stay out of the new boss, old boss, you know, we're the new bosses in town, we have to be pretty clear that we are not using the survivors who come to us, exploiting them as ticks on our intake forms or for our grant purposes, that they are there by their own choice and we are not convincing them that this is what they need. Pediatric medical trauma means that somewhere the child learned that going to the doctor or the dentist is not good. They have been abused medically. It can be the family's vision of going to see the doctor or the dentist. It can be that they were assaulted when they were very young, and going to the doctor now and lying down on the exam table, whether it's the dentist or a doctor, for an exam, is going to cause them a whole bunch of stress and triggers and put them back somewhere where they don't want to be. And this is why I believe we begin to see survivors coming into our agencies who have dire dental work done. Very scary to see someone coming over you trying to put implements in your mouth, okay? Disasters can be man-made. They can be like Hawaii with the volcanoes erupting, but they can be very trauma-inducing. I want to talk for a moment about terrorism and war zone traumas. Think about people, survivors who live in poverty, who live in gang territory and are seeing terrorism and living with terrorism and war zone traumas throughout their daily life. They have no idea if they leave their house, even kids, if a stray bullet's going to come get them at whatever time. All right. Something we don't think about is sleep trauma, which is so important because the neurochemicals present in the brain by both trauma and drugs can interrupt, and often does interrupt, the normal sleep sleep cycle, which can result in insomnia, bad dreams, nightmares, daytime fatigue, which is all part of PTSD. We don't talk often about nutritional trauma, and we're going to dive into these deeper later on. But I'm just telling you that food can either be poison or it can be medicine for the body. And if it's poison, it's going to exacerbate the trauma in the mind and in the body caused by both the trauma that the survivor has suffered as well as the trauma the survivor suffers due to chemicals. So it's an integral part of recovery, okay? All right, and self-neglect. Self-neglect is very, very important because if you're taught to believe that you are worthless, why take care of yourself? And understanding if this is a medical or a mental something or just an internal belief that's held, very important. I'm going to go into ideological oppression a little bit, oppression a little bit more, and microaggression a little bit more here, because this is the only place I'm going to do it in this presentation. Oppression has 4 basic things to it. Ideological oppression is the idea, it's called ideological oppression, the idea that one group is superior and has the right to control another group. Institutional oppression is society and laws and institutions that uphold the superiority and reinforce this ideological oppression with policies and practices. Okay, is that making sense to everyone? All right. And then we have internalized oppression, which basically means that it's the ideological and the institutional are reinforced at the individual level, which gives permission to disrespect and mistreat others from the less than group. Okay. Internalized oppression means that the less than group is then internalizing this oppression because of the nature of the system. Most people in the dominant group are not consciously oppressive. They have internalized the negative messages about other groups and consider their attitudes towards the other group quite normal. They've never been called on their behaviors, whereas the less than group has internalized it. All right. That's a lot to consider, okay? None of these 4 aspects, the ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized oppression, can exist separately. They're completely mixed up with each other, and it's crucial to see oppression as a system, and it should be clear that trying to challenge oppression in any of the 4 aspects will affect the other 3. And this is really true when we're working with survivors. Any questions, comments, opinions on that right now? All right. I'm going to let you think on that while I go into microaggressions. Microaggressions are verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicates, which communicate hostility, or they're derogatory, or they're negative messages to target people based solely on their marginalized status. All right? I have had my children say to me at times, "Do not look at me in that tone of voice." That's a microaggression from me to them, not the other way around, okay? There are 2 kinds of microaggressions that I want to talk about. One is the micro assault, which is explicit racial or derogatory word and or actions intended to hurt. And we have all heard those slurs. You can make a list of them. I'm not asking you to share them right now. Excuse me, there are 3 microaggressions, but the micro assault, you know, for addicts, if their lips are moving, they're lying. That's a microaggression and or micro assault, and we need to be careful about how we talk and use that. There's a micro insults, which are verbal or nonverbal communications that subtly convey rudeness, insensitivity, and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. Kind of like using he to refer to all people, kind of like refusing to learn somebody's name, their English, their name, because it's not English sounding or it's not an English-based name. That's an insult. Micro invalidations. They're totally micro invalidations. It's just that they're invalidating somebody's thoughts or feelings, and it's done on a global level. In other words, labeling an assertive female as a bee while describing an assertive male as a forceful leader. Or a female saying, as a woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority. That is not true. It is demeaning, and it's an invalidation, okay? So I want us to be really aware of that as we move forward. Okay, but what we say about abuse is that when it happens in our life, life stops and survival begins, just like what we say for using, okay? But what abuse does in any case is turning reality on its head. False deceptions, promises, betrayals, threats, dependence on the abuser and or the drug, breaking down resistance, overwork, lack of basic necessities, disorientation, coercion, which is so important, intimidation, fear, shock, exhaustion, and all of these combined or individually create trauma. Okay. All righty. So underlying all of these dynamics are coercion and control. Okay, both of these dynamics are coercion and control. Coercion may involve the actual infliction of physical pain or injury or psychological harm in order to enhance the credibility of a threat that results in, quote, seeming obedience or cooperation and is randomly enforced. Connect this back to domestic violence, and sexual assault is often there's sexual assault and domestic violence. How many times does a perpetrator need to use abuse, physically abuse someone? Once, and reinforce it randomly. These are the invisible chains that bind the victim to the perpetrator, all right? It also forces the survivor to act in an involuntary manner, subtle, and it's often legal use of words or implied actions, okay? What it does do in reality is take away the victim's liberty or freedom and strips them of their sense of self. It's intentional control tactics. How many of you, when you were kids, knew you were going to get it when you went home because of some physical look on your parents' face? The way they smiled, lifted an eyebrow, put their hands on their hips, the look, whatever it was, that's coercion. And you straightened up and you did right, all right? Control, or in this case, coercive control, is the way an abuser gains and maintains power over the survivor in order to subject that person to psychological, physical, sexual, or financial abuse. Please think about that also in terms of addiction, about the drug. And the motivation of the abused person to comply, to go with this initially are varied, and that's with them. But the tactics used are generally always physiological, psychological, and sometimes with drugs biologically abusive. But you could also make the case that beating somebody can be, and giving them STDs and unwanted pregnancies is also biologically abusive. Okay, all right. So I want us all to start thinking about those and the traumatic bonding that comes with a little bit of yum with a whole lot of yuck, both with chemical dependency and with sexual assault. But what all of these negative things do, especially if they're piled fundamentally one on top of the other, is that they fundamentally change someone's cognitive belief systems. You're going to have, it varies what happens from person to person, but they can co-occur, they can pile on, and especially if they're negative, they're going to change somebody's belief system. You have acute, which is the single incident. You have which could be a serious injury that happens once, like with a car crash. You can have the chronic, which is repeated over time and prolonged. And you can have the complex, which is and multiple traumas. And chronic and complex can overlap. It can be the same abuse chronically repeated over time. And all of this is going to affect the function and structure in the brain that negatively affects all stages of social, emotional, and cognitive development. The other thing I want you to understand is that traumatic memories are less easily translated into language, because when somebody, I'm not going into neurobiology, but of trauma, but this is a basic part of it. When the amygdala is triggered because of trauma, or it senses trauma, the frontal lobe goes offline, and the portions of the brain, or the amygdala, which is programmed for survival, goes online. Words, remembering chronologically in order, is offline, and the memories are stored in the amygdala. All right, the negative memories are stored in the amygdala. The brain now is permanently altered. Okay, but what happens with the traumatic memories is that they create schemas. Schemas are mental. I'm going to talk. Negative schemas are caused by trauma tend to be irrational. Schemas are mental constructs that are mainly formed early in childhood, probably up to the age of 4 or 5, and they represent a person's core beliefs and values. They usually run on an unconscious level, and they're maladapted, usually negative, and they're expressed in absolutes, total absolutes, okay? And they provide a framework for representing the world that the person, the survivor, lives in, and a lens for interpreting reality without question, what we believe. We accept it without questions or beliefs, and they usually manifest themselves in this way. I'm unlovable. By the survivor, I'm unlovable. I'm such a big failure. People are cruel. Nobody cares about me. Everybody leaves me in the end. Therefore, I'm never going to get what I want. And if that is there in the amygdala, in that emotional portion of the brain, it is very, very hard to access, and it is very, very hard to change. So with these perceptions, these negative schemas in place, especially if they've been taking place for a long time, you get the cognitive belief systems that are also going to be changed. And here they are. Since nobody can be trusted, you also know that you cannot survive alone, but nobody can be trusted. And you're in that loop of saying, no is life-threatening because it means that the abuser is going to beat me or do something bad to me, where saying no may keep me alive. And you have all these things going on in your head at the same time, that I need help, but help will only betray me. And if you're in that negative schema, what do? We are always looking for stuff in our world to validate what we already know, both positive and negative. And if our viewpoint is mostly negative, that is what we are going to be looking to validate. So if the victim's worldview is, I grew up with violence or abuse in my home, I'm beginning, because it was so normalized, the abuse was so normalized, I don't even recognize it anymore. My family's code or motto was, we don't wash family secrets in public. We don't tell. So therefore, I'm going to have a very rigid world view of what's right or wrong. No one can be trusted. I have been labeled all my life, so now I'm put in an alternative school sometimes. So I'm now associating with sexually aggressive and or delinquent peers. And now I'm labeled as one of them, but this is totally normal for me. The world is not a safe place, and I need my path to stay with me so I'm not isolated and abandoned and alone to face the world. Is this making sense? Okay. All right. So now we have what's being called the 4 Fs, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. All right. And this is basically what they are. And you know the first 3 pretty well because that's what we've been taught. But I'm going to go over them very briefly. Fight. The survivor decides to fight back with either physical or verbal resistance. Whatever comes out of it, they're still alive. They're now hyper-arousal. They're always looking around for indications in their world that, or cues and clues that the threat is there. Flight. The victim's reaction is to flee, and the body mobilizes to leave the traumatic experience, which means people soil themselves, whether through voiding or using their clothing as a potty, or throwing up because they need to go, or they don't want to be around anyone else anymore, so they try to protect themselves that way. Freeze, the body literally shuts down. It could be tonic immobility, whatever it is, the numbing, the shutting down, the daze, the spacing out, the disassociation that keeps you, the daydreaming even, that keeps you away from what's happening in your universe. And the fawning is the merging with or trying to talk your way out of a stressful situation, and it's trying to reason or rationalize the situation and try to find common ground between you and the abuser. So this can be anything from flattering the abuser, cringing in obedience, attempting to please or seek favor, offering alternatives, whatever the survivor has to do to save themselves by talking their way out of this. This is what I call, in part, the Stockholm syndrome of identifying with the survivor as identifying with the perpetrator as a way of surviving. All right. All right. So we, as advocates, need to understand help-seeking behavior. And help seeking in the present is affected and influenced by past seeking attempts. You know, some may have had to cooperate in order to survive, and that includes with the authority figures, including us as well. Some may be triggered by feelings of helplessness, which means that if they've been exposed to multiple forms of abuse and they've experienced authority figures, whether it's first responders to advocates, it's going to narrow the pool of who they can work with, diminishes, they're not going to get the services. We're going to have to make sure that they can trust us. And how do we establish that trust quickly and stay out of talking and understanding? We need to understand as advocates the societal oppressions and the microaggressions that might have been heard. That means that there's been negative reactions of helpers, which causes victim blaming, even it deepens their internal devaluation. Do you see how all of these feed into each other? You know, so my thing is, let's be mindful of the feelings of helplessness that people are coming in. This is an act of courage, stating that, telling them you can understand that this is really difficult and you're here to help. You're going to make mistakes. And I want to talk about that. And when you see them checking out, to say, it seems to me like I've done something to offend you. Can we talk about that? So giving them the power and control, letting them know that they are in charge. If they need to get a glass of water, they need to end this. I don't care if it's 3 minutes into it. It's okay. We can reschedule, you know? Not start off with the meats and bones of it, but start off at the outer edges of someone's experiences. You know, use language that somebody can understand without talking down to them or above their heads. Because I'm going to tell you that not all forms of desperation look alike, that people are going to interpret things from their own cultural frame, their worldview, their schemas. Here it is. It's going to differ with each and every person, even if each and every person in the same family has experienced the same things. This is going to be very different for all of them. The physiological response, the same. But all forms of desperation do not look alike. And what I would choose to do when I'm desperate is not necessarily what anybody else on this webinar would choose to do. I want to talk about different treatment modalities. This is really, really important. We've got the rehabs, the private counseling, the religious 12-step groups, therapeutic communities, and other modalities. All right. General questions to ask about rehab is not if you've been to rehab. You want to know, detox only? For what drugs? I've had people tell me, oh, I was in detox. For what drugs? Oh, well, you know, it was for heroin, and now I just drink a little bit. Clues, okay? How long was the stay supposed to be? How long did they stay? And how long since their stay? Because if someone tells you they've been in rehab and they're just drinking a little bit now, well, it's been 3 years since their stay, you've got some big red flags waving right in your face. So let's talk about this, because we need all this information. We don't need to lose this valuable information. If they said that they were a 7-day stay, they were admitted to a medical detox facility, whether it's in a standalone medical detox or in a hospital. The survivor was released after becoming medically stable. The focus was totally on the survivor's medical stability, and they will get, upon release, written information about addiction, local 12-step meetings, and housing programs. Do you think that the survivor is at this point, their brain, their body is in any way to take in this new information? The short answer is it is not. Okay. If someone says to you they were in for 2 weeks, 14 days, It's usually they were in a medical facility due to the severity of the withdrawal, and or they had insurance to be there. And insurance is the key word there. If they were remanded to a county hospital because they couldn't pay, that is one thing. If they went on their own because family intervention and they had insurance, that's telling you something different. After the client becomes medically stable in a 2-week rehab, it's going to be an intensive case management for the rest of the time that's going to focus on stable or sober housing, and with maybe a few 12-step meetings thrown in. Maybe. But we're going to leave with a list of 12-step meetings. Okay. 8 days, 28 days rehab. The person, the survivor, could be transferred in from a 2-week or even a 1-week rehab. It usually, if not, they usually spend the first week detoxing before attending lifestyle classes, 12-step meetings, counseling, and case management. And the survivor's family is usually involved because everyone in the family is affected or caused by affected by the drug and, chemical, by dependency issues. If we had more time, I would go into systems theory by John Bowden, so you can look that up if you want. But the main focus of a 28-day rehab is to establish a base for sobriety, generally 12-step focus, and to find sober housing upon leaving. And again, this usually means the person has insurance, whether through their job or through their family. Okay, private counseling. We want to know that the counselor is totally aware of and sexual assault issues and chemical dependency issues, and when to step up and when to step back with each of them. Because if somebody goes to counseling and is hiding one or the other from the counselor, it's not going to work. What also is not going to work is that the counselor, the client, the survivor has to be comfortable with counseling and motivated to change. So the questions to ask are, what was the survivor's experience? How much time did they think treatment would take? And what was the frequency of their appointments? And did they make them? Because counseling pretty much is an internal job. And what is the survivor trying to escape? What's inside of them? This creates some weird internal dynamics, and it's painful and it's hard work. And we need to be aware of that when we're seeing our survivors. Okay. We have religious 12-step groups, which are just that, religious in nature. And although a lot of 12-step meetings are held in houses of worship because they're basically free, this does not make them religious in nature. Or I want to remind people that the 12-step program in general, except for religious 12-step programs, are spiritual in nature. So if someone's going to a program and they say religious, and they're spiritual in nature unless they are identified as a religious 12-step program. I have worked with some clients who found this a comfort and a way to attain peace and serenity and sobriety in their life. For other clients who started out with this, it didn't work so well for them. That's okay. This is a road. Recovery is a road, and discovery on the road, it's an adventure. It's discovery on the road. I want everyone to be aware that Narconon International is a Scientology organization that promotes the theories of the founder of L. Ron Hubbard. It does not use the 12 steps. is not affiliated with the 12-step program in any way, shape, or form, like Narcotics Anonymous or Narcanon or any 12-step program. I said that, but the name is confusing, and it was deliberately used to confuse. All right. Not trying to put down Scientology, just trying to make y'all understand. 12-step programs. I have a lot of issues with the 12-step programs, and I could go on for days about this. I'm not going to. What I want to make everybody aware of, that in 1935, Dr. Bob and Bill W. codified this. They were two middle-aged, well-educated, upper white men. What relevance does it hold in 2018 and moving forward for anyone who isn't upper middle class, white, well-educated, especially white men? This needs to be explored with the survivors themselves when they say that they're going to enter a 12-step program. Information is key, so much so that different meetings have different focuses. And it is really important to understand the different focuses that they have, whether it's open or closed meeting. Open meaning that anybody can attend the meeting, closed meaning that it is closed just for people. AA is usually more open about saying we're having an open AA meeting. You'll see it on there. Closed means you have to be an AA member, not someone who's trying to figure out if this is right for them. All right. Some have literal interpretations of the big book. Some do not. Some meetings are online. Some are not. I'm going to make a suggestion for advocates who are working in the field of addiction. Please, 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 if you are going to go, you're going to recommend that your survivors go to 12-step meetings, go and attend meetings in the various locations that exist in your community. Tell them you show up and tell them what you're there for. If you're invited in, great. If you're not, do not despair, because I can't tell you the times that I made a suggestion for someone to go who was an addicted survivor of rape, and there was a long porch in front of this one meeting hall where everybody stood and smoked. It was basically men, and it triggered her, and it was not to a happy result. Know what they are there, what they focus on, what it looks like, how to get there, the transportation, everything involved in it, because it's there. I also go over the anonymity part of it with survivors, because if you are also, especially living in a smaller town or community, and you're going to a 12-step meeting yourself, you need to figure out if you want, what you're going to do if you see your survivors there. No outing and what that means. Also, it is a take what you like, leave the rest. And initially, those meetings may be confusing to survivors. They are certainly in your therapy rooms, in your counseling rooms. It is certainly okay for you to talk about for them to talk about and process what they heard, not outside of that. Okay. I found this online with Rape Survivors Anonymous. It just, you know, the 8th step made a list of all persons or actions of our actions have harmed as a result of being raped and became willing to make amends to them all. I don't know what the hell that means, and it really upset me. If you bit your rapist, does that mean you go back and make amends to them for biting? So we need to be careful with that and make direct amends to such people wherever possible. How about hurting yourself? Why? I'm not going to go into it, but then again, it's just very upsetting to me. I'm going to talk about therapeutic communities. The community is considered to be the therapy, and this is the first place where I heard of you can't habilitate. You can't do rehabilitation if the person hasn't been habilitated in the first place. So this is a community that believes in self-help. It believes in, there's a change agents in there. So there's mutual self-help. Client is usually not asked about during intake about sexual abuse or sexual assault issues. It's drug-free. It's also highly confrontive, and that may not work with people who have a history of abuse in their background because it may trigger them. And they're generally the TCs are usually gender specific. Okay, but to understand the principles of a therapeutic community and incorporate some of that into maybe our treatment plans or whatever, I can suggest that. I work there, I like it. There are other modalities like the 16 steps of discovery and empowerment, and I can't think of the doctor's name right now, who believes that the 12-step program is highly misogynistic and very victim blaming. And so she created the 12 steps of discovery and empowerment. There's smart recovery, white mice, and you can go online, you can find a lot of people and where they do it. Dual Recovery Anonymous is usually for people who have mental illness as well as addiction. I want to hone in on this because I know we're drawing short on time and we don't have much time left. But counseling, addiction and sexual assault, very different perspectives, and please understand this. In counseling, sexual abuse history often goes unknown, and in sexual assault, many times sexual assault addiction is unknown. The client is often referred to in addiction to the 12 steps, and they're responsible for making choices using the 12 steps. Sexual assault, it's a collaborative endeavor. One of the things that I had found most frustrating to me when I was working, because of the grants that I worked on, when I was at the recovery and when I was at the sexual assault, I was not allowed to do dual train. I could not. If I was at the recovery, it was only sexual assault, and I had to refer out for addiction and vice versa. I'm going to suggest that we make collaborations, MOUs with our addiction partners, or do the Ross thing of the recovery stuff, so that we can keep ourselves informed and the other counselors informed of what's going on with the client. Very, very important. Because in chemical dependency, the focus is on the part the individual played in the situation, where in sexual assault, the blame is always on the perpetrator, always, no exceptions. But both the dynamics of sexual assault and chemical dependency involve issues of power and control, okay? I want to talk about integrations of services very, very quickly. The global approach is, where does the survivor define themselves and fitting in culturally, personally, intellectually, spiritually in their world, and them listening to them talk about this, asking them questions about who do you identify with, what do you like to eat, what do you define this for me, is a great basis of understanding them, listening to them, validating the survivor, and at the same time, a great way to create a treatment plan or a case management plan. The global part of it is to write it down in their hopes and their dreams and in their words, and look at this together with the survivor, for prioritize categories and the items that go in that, and point out to the survivor how their thinking complements and adheres to your program's rules, regulations, and procedures. Interdisciplinary approach, this is your outreach. This is where, This is your outreach, and it's going to look different in each community, but how do you bring the necessary players on board in your community who can basically help you? And this means long-term residential care to meet the complex needs of addicted survivors, for PTSD, their loss of identity, to provide structure and safety, and to break their own internal denial process that needs to go on. So this means that we're going to be working with sexual assault and substance abuse counselors and advocates, victim advocates from all the systems that we work with, child service agencies, faith-based organizations, housing authority organizations, transportational systems, recovery-oriented systems of care, ROSC. If you have them in your neighborhood, check them out and use them, or your locality, because we need to coordinate everything for knowing to make our clients successful. Because if they have to go to a protective parenting class at CPS at 6 o'clock on Saturday night and be in a drug court at 6:45 and the same night across town, lugging their children with them, what do you think they're going to choose? Going back to jail, or they're going to make decisions? We need to coordinate them, because we have so many things that are required: employment, transportation, care, and the list goes on and on and on. So what I'm going to say is we need to have strong collaboration between all agencies. Okay, that pretty much puts me 1 minute over. Are there any questions, suggestions? Anything? Like I said, this is being recorded, and it will be on TAASA's YouTube channel within 10 days. Also want